Good afternoon, and welcome to Arctic News Monday from Group 2. I'm your host, Ethan Haluza-Delay. Our main stories today. Environmental protests against wind farms built on Norwegian Sami lands reached a new peak, exhibiting the complicated nature of the green transition. Melting permafrost will reshape Canadian landscapes in the north. A new study examines how this will affect even the course of rivers. And a snapshot of Alaskan culture in a time of challenge. The Iditarod dog-sled race kicked off last week, but the pressure of the pandemic, inflation, and climate change are showing. And finally, the city of Tromsø in the Norwegian Arctic is growing in importance as NATO military planning and strategy turns north. All this and more. Arctic News on Monday starts right now. But first, we begin with last week's key events. The administration of American President Joe Biden approved the Willow Oil Project last Monday, a controversial drilling project in the National Petroleum Reserve of Arctic Alaska. President Biden's government faced a complicated decision-making environment. Many Alaskan politicians, inhabitants, and indigenous groups spoke out in favor of the project for its economic benefits. Yet, other local indigenous communities spoke out against its likely impacts on the fragile Arctic ecosystem, while national environmentalists decried the eventual carbon emissions that would result from the extraction. In what seems to be an attempt to soften the blow, the administration announced March 12th that they would limit drilling in adjacent terrestrial and marine spaces. A train derailed Sunday, March 12th, while approaching the port of Narvik, Norway, closing down the line's freight tracks. The train was carrying iron ore from the LKAB-owned Kiruna mine in Sweden to the ice-free Norwegian port. The two mines LKAB operates in northern Sweden are among the largest in the world and produce approximately 80% of Europe's iron ore production. The port of Narvik is the primary export terminal for the Kiruna mine's output, with 10 ore trains running the line in each direction every day. As a result, this interruption represents a significant blow to the company's export capacity and highlights the infrastructure choke points to the economic development of the Arctic. The Arctic Circle Japan Forum, a satellite forum of the annual Arctic Focus Assembly in Reykjavik, Iceland, wrapped up in Tokyo, March 6th. The three-day conference was focused on the theme of Asia in the future of the Arctic, coming a decade after China, South Korea, Singapore, and Japan were admitted as observers to the Arctic Council. Government representatives from the 5 Asian observers to the Council attended the conference and highlighted each of their countries' plans for future engagement in the Arctic. However, with the uncertainty over the continued functioning of the Arctic Council, emphasis was also placed on broadening cooperation with the Arctic states beyond the preeminent Arctic institution. And Norway will present the program for their upcoming Arctic Council chairship on March 28th in Tromsø. This launch will come days before the annual Arctic Encounter Symposium in the American city of Anchorage, Alaska, where it is expected meetings between some of the Council's officials will discuss the Norwegian priorities for their chairship of the Council. Finally, the Finnish Ministry of the Environment announced March 9th that they will establish a Sami Climate Council as an independent expert body advising on climate policy from the perspective of Sami knowledge, culture, and rights. This new body has the potential to be a model for other states, ensuring that the voices of Indigenous peoples are formally included in decision-making processes on climate change. Next, we turn to our main stories, a deep dive on last week's Arctic news. For our first segment, we turn to Anthony Maio, our political affairs correspondent, with a special report on the Sami wind turbine protests.
From February 27th to March 3rd, Greta Thunberg joined protests in Norway against wind farms that operate on land used by indigenous Sami reindeer herders. The protesters blocked access to building entrances of the Norwegian Energy and Finance ministers in Oslo to protest against 2 wind farms built on Sami reindeer grazing grounds. On March 1st, 10 people, including Thunberg, were removed by police from the entrance of the Ministry of Finance, according to a spokesperson for the Oslo Police District. Norway's Supreme Court ruled that the wind farm permits were invalid in October of 2021. It was decided that the turbines violated the protected cultural rights of the Sami people by infringing on reindeer grazing lands, and violated Sami rights under international conventions. But nearly a year and a half on, the turbines are still operating. Importantly, the Sami community is calling for the turbines to be torn down and the reindeer grazing lands to be restored. Greta has stated that indigenous rights, human rights, must go hand in hand with climate protection and climate action. That can't happen at the expense of some people. That is not climate justice in Norway, she said. On March 2nd, the Norwegian energy minister apologized after holding talks with the Sami representatives. The state secretary in the Norwegian Ministry of Petroleum stated that it does not follow from the Supreme Court judgment that the wind turbines must be taken down. The government is looking for solutions that make it possible for reindeer herding and the wind turbines to operate side by side. Wind energy is an important part of Norway's green transition. Sami protesters have stated that you cannot have a green shift that violates human rights or indigenous rights. Some protesters have referred to the Norwegian government's actions as green colonization, a term the Norwegian government says is misleading and incorrect. The community has stated that it is not the Sami that caused the climate crisis, and their traditional way of life, which has been practiced for millennia, should not be jeopardized by efforts to resolve it. They are demanding an energy transition that is equitable and fair. The Sami people already live on the front line of the climate crisis. The Arctic is warming as much as 4 times faster than in the rest of the world. It is yet to be seen whether the solution of compromise and compensation proposed by the Norwegian government will be accepted by the Sami community. This story that has developed over the past few weeks is far from resolved and is creating a political and communication crisis within the Norwegian government. The Sami were the first indigenous people of Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Their presence extends from Norway to Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Studies suggest that they have inhabited these northern areas for more than 9,000 years, likely being the first people living in the Arctic after the Ice Age. This political crisis is directly related to the concept of climate justice, a problem facing many governments around the globe.
Next up, new research on the evolution of rivers in Canada's north is changing our understanding of the future of melting Arctic permafrost. Environmental correspondent Alison Miller has this story.
Here in Ottawa, Canada, the coming of spring sees a surge in the size and strength of rivers around the city, as increasing temperatures add water from rain and snowmelt. Throughout the year, however, a different process is also at work: erosion, something that will gradually change the way our rivers look. Erosion is a part of any river, but for a long time it was thought that climate change, with its impact on permafrost melting and higher temperatures, would have a much greater impact in Canada's Arctic. Recent research, however, may be confronting this long-held belief. New research, published in the journal Nature and Climate Change and led by University of British Columbia researcher Alison, draws on 50 years of satellite photos of Canada's northern riverways and states that rather than increasing the erosion of large rivers, we should expect to see climate change limit changes to the shape of them, a trend that Jelpi and his team have tracked in data going back to the 1970s and which shows a 20% decrease in the movement of rivers. The slowdown is attributed in part to what is known as Arctic greening, a process that has existed for thousands of years as cycles of warming and cooling of the climate. These cycles then increase and decrease seasonal rains and forest fires, leading to the expansion and retraction of natural tree lines that mark the border of the Arctic. Essentially, as trees and shrubs receive more resources, they create seeds and grow into areas that were previously unreachable to them. This expansion can also be called shrubification, as the smaller bushes of Canada's far north are often some of the first in line to make the jump. But with climate change acting on the Arctic far more quickly than elsewhere, this process is being sped up, meaning new shrubs are quickly finding root in riverbanks and, contrary to previously held ideas, are stabilizing Arctic rivers against erosion. So what does this mean for Canada and for other Arctic nations? Jelpi and his team outlined that the slowing of rivers will impact the carbon stocks of floodplains and the natural neutralization of CO2 that comes from sediments associated with erosion. What this means is that there will be a greater uncertainty of how Arctic rivers will impact national carbon budgets. Ironically, the slowing of rivers will also likely change the process of shrubification itself, as plants rely on rivers to send seeds downstream. The findings of the report are still in the early stages, and so Jelpi and his team have avoided speculating on what the effect of this slowing down of river movement will have on flora and fauna. What we can speculate on is the impact that it may have on northern communities. This includes changes to hydroelectric development, an important renewable source of energy for Canada's communities in the north that still primarily rely on diesel fuel. Other areas include traditional food stocks, and finally the availability of materials as the tree line moves north. Although the full extent of the team's findings are restricted to large rivers due to data availability, Jelpi and his team hope that they will be able to expand their research in the future, and that their findings will encourage people to not, quote, take anything for granted and always look for surprises. For Arctic News Monday, this is Alison Miller.
Thank you, Alison, for keeping us updated with new insights on the future of the Arctic. Next, we turn to a special report on the Iditarod dog-sled race, which this year has become a snapshot of the impacts of climate change, the pandemic, and inflation on the Arctic cultural activities of Alaska's inhabitants. We turn to our correspondent Shaun Sederoff for that story.
Thank you, Ethan. We're now nearing the conclusion of the Iditarod race here in Alaska. The Iditarod is the most prestigious sled dog race in the world, taking competitors over 2 mountain ranges, the frozen Yukon River and the treacherous Bering Sea ice in frigid temperatures before ending in the old gold rush town of Nome. The roughly 10 days event's 51st iteration began with a ceremonial start in Anchorage on Saturday, followed by a competitive start in Willow on Sunday, March 5th, and is set to end on March 19th. The Iditarod Trail is a national historic trail established as a route for dog sleds to access remote snowbound areas in the early 1900s to support the sudden heavy traffic following the gold rush, with mushers hauling the gold, mail, supplies, and equipment. In 1973, the first commemorative race to honor the part sled dogs played in Alaska's history, especially the 1925 serum run to Nome, when 22 dog sled teams carried life-saving serum to rescue the children of Nome from a diphtheria outbreak that took place. As you can see behind me, two of the famous lead dogs, Balto and Togo, and their mushers are captured. This commemorative event evolved into the well-known 9 to 12 day race that is known for today. However, with only 33 mushers participating in the race over Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, concerns of the future of this iconic race have risen. The event serves as just one small snapshot of the effects of the pandemic and climate change on one of the Arctic's most famous cultural activities that have historically played an important part in attracting tourists. Inflation and the loss of deep-pocketed sponsors, with multiple big-name mushing champions retiring with few to take their place, has gone over for the past 5 years. The largest field was 96 mushers in 2008, with the average number starting the race over the last 50 years being 63. Many mushers have suffered from the pandemic and inflation. The collapse of tourism means that hundreds of tour operators, many of whom are Indigenous workers that maintain the rest checkpoints, handle logistics, and were mushers, some of whom are represented by the 4 teams participating in the historic race this year, have been left out of work by the massive fall in tourism, something which has been mirrored in Finnish Lapland as well. The race itself only has a prize of roughly $50,000 US before taxes, and mushers have had to supplement their usual income from providing unique tours as the pandemic meant fewer summer visitors. This income was not only important for the racers to put together a race team, but played an important factor in maintaining the year-round kennels and veterinarians. Defending champion Brent Sass, seen behind me with his lead dog, and who exited the race due to health concerns this year, has spoken of his experience personally taking care of 58 dogs, saying the expense for food alone for the past year is near equal to what the winner pocketed from his last win. Some have gone on to work in other careers during the year to supplement their income. The twin mushers, Anna and Christy Barrington, seen behind me, have said, "It is a full-time job to give the everyday attention dogs need to be cared for, but income is supplemented by commercial fishing and carpentry all summer to make ends meet." Another factor is the work of members from the ethical treatment of animals, PETA, to end the race, which has resulted in Alaska Airlines, ExxonMobil, Coca-Cola, and Wells Fargo ending the sponsorships. Climate change has forced organizers to move the starting line 467 kilometers north from Willow to Fairbanks in 2003, 2015, and 2017 because of a lack of snow in the Alaska Range, altogether leaving in question the viability of this unique sport for the coming years.
Thank you, Shaun. For our last story of the hour, we turn to Jacob Braun, our foreign affairs correspondent, live on location. Take it away, Jacob.
Thank you, Ethan. Right now, I am in Tromsø, Norway, where I've arrived after a brief stay in Narvik in the Ofoten district. These are some pretty interesting places right now, but not for the reasons you think I'll be mentioning. Usually, the places I mentioned are renowned for their natural beauty. Fjords and mountains are plentiful up here in the north of the Arctic Circle, where around 105,000 people call their home. Aside from the popularity with polar tourists, the environments of Tromsø and the Ofoten district provide Norway with a significant farming, fishing, and mining industry, as well as large hydropower stations and a remarkable population of seabirds. However, today these places are important for reasons other than their beauty. Their proximity to the Russian Kola Peninsula has been the cause of contention since the era of the Cold War. Norway, a founding member of NATO, maintained their Arctic border with the former Soviet Union until its dissolution in 1991. Now, the region's defenses are being increasingly improved following a year of war between Russia and Ukraine, as Russia continues to act erratically and volatile on the global stage. The strategic importance of northern Norway is crucial to NATO operations in the Arctic. Tromsø itself is home to a U.S. Navy base and can provide logistical support and rear line defense for forward operating bases further located north above the Arctic Circle. The reason for Tromsø's importance at present is because on March 6th, 3 NATO exercises began south of the city, comprising 20,000 troops from 7 NATO members plus Sweden and Finland. Exercise Joint Viking includes the bulk of these troops, focusing on building military preparedness in the event of Russian escalation on NATO's Arctic frontier. Exercise Joint Warrior is a British-led seaborne exercise conducted by elements of the Royal Navy, further ensuring NATO's readiness should areas of northern Norway come under attack. In the eventuality of a conflict, this exercise will prepare soldiers to securely ferry supplies across from the United Kingdom to northern Norway, where they can then be distributed to prospective NATO members Sweden and Finland. Finally, Exercise Arctic Forge is an American-led exercise with the purpose of increasing American troop capabilities in Arctic conditions. This exercise mainly comprises American troops who were stationed in Europe and Africa, but also Finnish troops. NATO's frontier with Russia would more than double with Finland's accession to the organization, from 1,200 kilometers to around 2,600 kilometers of border, which is why good preparedness and well-trained military forces are a necessity should Russia's involvement in Ukraine escalate to include NATO. In addition to NATO's military exercises in the Arctic, the United Kingdom has also established a military base approximately 120 kilometers south of Tromsø to be used for a period of 10 years to house troops of the British Littoral Response Group. Aptly named Camp Viking, the base symbolizes the increasing cooperation and resolve among NATO in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As of yet, Russian state media has not yet reported on NATO exercises in northern Norway, nor on the establishment of a British military base in relative proximity to Russian naval bases, which house nuclear submarines. However, intelligence reports discern that the Russian military is reopening Cold War-era bases and re-strengthening them on the Kola Peninsula, and is interfering with Norwegian communications infrastructure as a possible form of retaliation for NATO exercises being conducted nearby. The current exercises are scheduled to end on March 17th. The planning for the next set in 2024 have already begun between Norway, Sweden, and Finland. We will report more on the situation as it develops, though it seems to have quieted down in the Arctic for now. Back to you, Ethan.
Thank you for braving the wind out there to bring us that report, Jacob. I hope you're keeping warm. And that brings us to the end of this broadcast of Arctic News Monday. This is Group 2, signing off.